With a new administration coming in very soon, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops have said they will speak loudly if his key promise, the one that probably won him everything, that is to get rid of those folks who have no business being here in the first place, if he follows through on that, they will speak loudly. Bear in mind that for the past 4 years, we have had a Catholic running the country who openly rejects the church's moral authority and church's teachings on all things morality. And they, for whatever reason, weren't all that interested in speaking loudly when he did numerous things that violated the faith. But now they will speak loudly. And there's a very, very good reason for this. Because they will find that their bottom line is being threatened. The U.S. bishops are in the business of managing several NGOs, non-governmental organizations. These are non-profit organizations, and they all have deep ties to the government. And one of the things they do with government is that issue that won 47 everything last week. You have to be careful how you talk about this stuff on this platform. Our hosts very much do not like that topic being critiqued in the slightest, so we do have to tread very carefully here. But these bishops make an enormous amount of money on that issue. They have no qualms about it. And I will show you how they do this and what they're going to do. So let's go first to this story, the main story here, Catholic News Agency, with this headline: U.S. bishops will speak loudly if 47's big program rhetoric becomes reality. Yeah, okay. So this topic, what the incoming administration has promised to do, threatens the pocketbooks of the U.S. bishops. Here is proof of this. You see, I'm going to show you an article from almost 4 years ago that outlines how the USCCB gets its money. This is not from Lepanto Institute. You can go much deeper on this topic if you want to through the Lepanto Institute. But you're going to see just how lucrative this subject matter is for the U.S. bishops. The U.S. bishops are essentially nonprofit organization managers first and foremost. They're certainly behave like shepherds. They don't seem to care that much about souls, because if they did, they'd give the outgoing administration, and would have given the outgoing administration, nothing but grief for 4 years for all the anti-Catholic things they've done. But here is this article is from The Pillar. It was published in August of 2021 with the headline, How the USCCB Gets Its Money and Where It Goes. And there's a lot of this that is not that interesting to me, but I want to go down here to the government grants section to give you an idea of where this money came from. Where do they get their money? And again, we have to tread carefully because of the subject of this, so please bear with me as I swap words out. But here's what the Pillar has to say about where the USCCB gets its money in terms of its government contracts. Quote, another significant portion of USCCB revenue comes from government grants. In 2019, these grants totaled $52.7 million in revenue. The money comes from government programs providing services to people who move to my country from elsewhere under the Department of Health and Human Services and the State Department. And the grants, like national collections, are restricted funds. The USCCB is responsible to the U.S. government to show that the funds are directed to the intended services, and any money not spent on their designated activities must be refunded. The largest piece of government funding the USCCB received in 2019 came from a set of grants totaling $23 million as part of the UAC program, which is a federal program involving those new would-be Americans that are kids without people known to be their parents with them. This represented 1% of the $1.8 billion which the Department of Health and Human Services spent on that program in 2019. A number of those programs' other grants also went to religiously affiliated institutions, according to the Tracking, Accountability, and Government Grant Systems. This includes BCFS Health and Human Services, which has historical ties with the Baptists. There was also the Lutheran version of Catholic Charities, which received $37 million, and the Board of Child Care for the United Methodist Church. While the USCCB is the largest Catholic grant recipient, other Catholic organizations received separate grants from the UAC, including Catholic Charities of the Archdiocese of Miami. That $23 million the USCCB received from the UAC program does not represent a single grant, but instead is a collection of more than 20 grants from different services, included as redacted cash and metal medical assistance, and residential shelter services for kids who show up alone. And somewhat, quote, in other words, 47's campaign promises directly threaten the pocketbook of the USCCB. And also remember something else here. Any Catholic organization that it, and those are anybody who calls himself Catholic as an organization has to generally give money to the bishop, a portion of their proceeds. Any organization like that has to give money to the bishop, to the diocese. And then the diocese gives money to the USCCB. So there are countless Catholic organizations doing the work that these bishops feel is threatened. This is an enormous amount of money that they're sitting on. And this is why they're going to speak loudly. Keep that in mind as we go over the article from the Catholic News Agency about what they're going to be talking about in Baltimore this week. So you go back to the original article where we get this. So this is what they have to say. Quote, the bishops are taking a wait-and-see approach to what 47 does with this campaign promise to basically take away all the people who are not supposed to be present. But the bishops say they are prepared to speak out forcefully if he does advance his proposal in a way that undermines human dignity. Wonderful. That was a message delivered by the leadership of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on the first public day of their fall assembly held in Baltimore yesterday, 1 week after the big day. We're waiting to see just exactly what takes shape, said Bishop Mark Seitz, head of the USCCB Committee on the Moving of People, who spoke to members of the media alongside USCCB President Archbishop Timothy Broglio and Bishop Michael Burbridge, chairman of the USCCB's Committee on the Anti-Moloch topic. If the Trump administration moves forward in a way that violates human rights, Seitz said the bishops are prepared to raise our voice loudly. Seitz, the bishop of the Diocese of El Paso, has pushed back against the Texas government's attempt to restrict Catholic ministry to redacted in his diocese. He said Tuesday that the bishops were concerned about 47's rhetoric on that topic on the campaign trail, but that they don't want to get ahead of the administration before it announces concrete plans. We know that very often the reality is different from the rhetoric, he said. We'll watch and respond as needed. I'm going to interject here. If you've seen the person he has appointed as his chief agent to take care of that problem for him, it's not rhetoric. That guy is mission driven on that subject. If you don't know who I'm talking about, go look up his appointments and go look at the video clips of him testifying to Congress in the past on this. The man is deadly serious about the job. We know that very often the reality is different from the rhetoric, he said. We'll watch and respond as needed. Broglio stressed that while the bishops don't encourage the illicit act that they seem to defend, they insist that those who come here are taken care of as they represent the face of Christ in the poor. I think as we move forward, we hope there will be an earnest effort to repair the relevant laws and also to be a renewed respect for the dignity of the human person, said Broglio, who is the ordinary of the Archdiocese of the Military Services in the U.S. End quote. That is a Bergoglian response. That is the only way to describe it. Note how these same bishops who are often spoken about as if they're resisting implementing Francis's vision for the church are going to shift to becoming more openly Bergoglian in response to the outcome of that election. Funny how that works when your pocketbook is threatened. Now we go here to the National Catholic Register, because the Register they're much more mainstream. They're EWTN's print arm. People call EWTN conservative. I guess you can call it that. It's definitely not like the Reporter or anything. Here's their headline. How 47's win could impact the U.S. bishop's agenda. Challenges related to redacted and to anti-Moloch opportunities are likely to be highlighted at the bishop's forthcoming fall meeting. Note again how the bishops have been talking about this as if they were suddenly Francis super loyalists. They're invoking all the language that Francis uses when talking about this issue in Europe. Funny how that works out. Here's a relevant section 4 of the article. Quote, if past this prelude, the election results are almost guaranteed to be further addressed at the fall assembly, especially given the likelihood of a new U.S. president emboldened by a popular vote mandate and a Congress at least partially controlled by his fellow Republicans. Update, it will be controlled by them. That happened yesterday. For instance, Archbishop Broglio or another leadership figure could make additional comments on the challenges to Catholic commitments posed by 47, who campaigned on a controversial promise of removing huge numbers of people who aren't supposed to be here. Additionally, some of the anticipated agenda items for the 2024 Assembly will likely take on a different shape with 47 and not the person who lost in the Oval Office. Kenneth Craycraft, a moral theologian at Mount St. Mary's Seminary and School of Theology in Cincinnati, notes that the bishop's planned implementation of Dignitas Infinita, that is Francis's encyclical on infinite human dignity. We riffed on how heretical that document was a few months ago when it was issued. Declaration of the dicastery of the doctrine of the faith on human dignity could be applied in ways that are responsive to the current political moment. So, in other words, these bishops who Francis thinks are ultra conservative and too trad and who've been resisting him are all of a sudden going to be using his logic to protect their pocketbook. Nothing is more important, especially in the wake of the election, than to reaffirm the ontological dignity of every person as made in the image and likeness of God, Craycraft told the Register. In particular, with the Catholic Vance set to become 47's vice president, Craycraft says the time is right for the American bishops to call for a more robust pro-baby, pro-child policy, such as making birth free, in their application of Dignitas Infinita. The moral theologian sees this approach as consistent with a more positive vision than simply restricting the sacrifice to Moloch. At the same time, with 47 and Vance in office, Craycraft sees a need for the bishops to reassert their commitment to prudent charitable reform on the issue of people moving around a lot. This is an opportunity for the bishops to balance compassion for the people in question with care for the common good of the U.S. as a receiving nation, he said. End quote. That sounds great. But the balance he's saying needs to happen is true enough, but there is one kind of gigantic problem. 47 won because the balance between human dignity for the people we're talking about and the common good of the U.S. is so horribly out of balance that to restore balance of any kind will look like it violates human dignity. You cannot downplay the severity of the problem the U.S. is facing on that issue. And the human dignity of Americans has been violated on this topic for decades. It just has been. And you could see that as with the really violent consequences that have happened due to the status quo. Now, the other political faction violated the dignity of extremely desperate people from far off lands by using them to further their own partisan goals in America by violating all the country's norms and, yes, even laws on that issue. You cannot escape that. You can't escape that they did this on a scale so unimaginable that to restore order and balance will require a serious push in the other direction. This is really about money. Never forget that. And that's why I led with how much money various Christian groups make off of this issue from the government. That is the driving force for this. Can you imagine if this issue is actually solved? What will happen to Catholic charities? Will they function? Will they be able to? And I don't mean Catholic charities like little c charities. I mean the organization, Catholic charities, who are at the center of this problem. They are a massive barrier to evangelization, to the conversion of Americans who are rightly concerned about this issue because a high-profile organization operates against the very basic wishes of the population with the support of the bishops. And they don't ever seem to get cracked down on this. So now we go to another very questionable reporting on this, and that goes from the National Catholic Reporter with this headline. Archbishop Broglio gives appalling interview with Arroyo ahead of bishop's meeting. The bishop for the Archdiocese of the U.S. military comes closest to understanding the issue, and he is a major player at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He still wants a lot of these folks to come here, but he wants the legal process reformed. The National Catholic Reporter is upset that he isn't taking Francis's position on this, which is basically that they should be allowed to come without restriction and be welcomed with open arms, regardless of the consequences for the people of the country. That's the National Catholic Reporter's position. That's Francis's position. And that's the position of Catholic Charities. Broglio at least understands that this is an untenable position. Here's what the National Catholic here's what got the National Catholic Reporter so upset at the Archbishop for this. Quote, sometime this morning here in Baltimore at the U.S. Bishops' Assembly, Archbishop Timothy Broglio, the Archdiocese of the Military Services, will give his address as president of the conference. It is scary to think that of what he will say. Broglio did an interview with EWTN's Raymond Arroyo last week. It was appalling. In discussing the outcome of the election, Broglio said at one point, quote, A third concern would be trying to form the policy in question or the laws in question in this country so that the process that has led to 47's victory can be orderly, that it be legal, and that some of the unrest we've experienced at the area in question, Texas, Arizona, those places can be resolved. No mention of the human dignity of the people in question. In fact, earlier in the interview, he cited human dignity as one of the reasons Catholics supported 47. I would think certainly our preeminent concern for the dignity of the human person is one thing that would have influenced those voters. Apparently, the human dignity of the new arrivals didn't count, not with Catholics who supported 47 and not with the president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. There are two public policy issues about which there is near unanimity among the U.S. bishops: the sacrifice to Moloch and the moving around of people. As Catholics, we defend the unborn and those people without papers, and the unemployed and unhoused, all those who are defined in our society by what they lack, the uns. Why did Broglio not link the two issues most prominent in the campaign and most unifying for the conference he leads? Is he that terrified of challenging the incoming U.S. president? Equally appalling were Broglio's comments about synodality. Arroyo noted that the previous week he had interviewed Cardinal Raymond Burke, who had said synodality was undefined. Arroyo asked Broglio if that was true, and the Archbishop delivered something of a word salad and called it a nebulous process. The Archbishop was in the Synod Hall last month. He voted on the final document. Maybe he wasn't paying attention when they voted on paragraph 28 of that text, which states, in simple and concise terms, it can be said that synodality is a path of spiritual renewal and structural reform to make the church more participatory and missionary, that is, to make her more capable of walking with every man and woman radiating the light of Christ. End quote. Now, if you're paying attention, that's not a definition of synodality. That definition doesn't mean anything. It's just wish casting. That's all it is. It doesn't define anything, but don't try telling that to the Bergoglians. But you can see why they're upset about the topic at hand. Some in the USCCB seem to understand that Americans are beyond fed up with the issue at hand, and the incoming administration is going to take a hardline approach to solving it. Again, just look at the man who's been appointed to solve it. That guy has got the defenders of the status quo shaking. Now, speaking of the status quo defenders and their shaking, Archbishop Vigano wrote an incredibly spicy letter on called Some Considerations After the Electoral Victory by 47. I cannot read the full thing on this website. That's just not possible. The things he says in this are so spicy, but there's also, I don't always agree with Archbishop Vigano on everything he has to say, but on politics. But he does have there's an interesting excerpt here. So I'll just skip down to that as we round out this live stream. And here's what he has to say that I think is worth your consideration in all of this, because the USCCB are willing participants of a status quo that is being rejected by Americans. And the bishop's main task at hand that they may not even realize is that they have to address is how to preserve their legitimacy. Remember, the USCCB is not an apostolic organization. There's nothing in the church's laws that authorize national bishops' conferences to exist. They just kind of do. The Synod on Synodality wants to change that, but there's nothing that lends them legitimacy. And in fact, their behavior is undermining the legitimacy of the church in America. That is something very serious. And so they need to address, how are they going to operate in this new emerging environment? Here's what Vigano has to say. Again, being careful here because of how he phrases things. He says, the most remarkable element of this campaign, in my opinion, consists in the manifestation of the pride and concept of the self-proclaimed good guys, a pride that has made them deaf and blind to the true, real demands of the people, a concept that places them above the miserable daily affairs of the vulgar and places them in a virtual world, in a surreal metaverse in which normal people are not allowed. It is the metaverse of the elite, with its program, its religion, high priests, its prophets, its rituals, its dogmas, its holy books, and its idols. The only thing the loser had to do was make this dystopia irreversible by making the official religion of the United States of America and its ideological colonies. Bergoglio, the Jesuits with their U.S. leaders, Thomas Rees and James Martin, the U.S. Cardinals in the line of McCarrick, and the entire Bergoglian episcopate were waiting for nothing else, replicating in the ecclesial sphere that irredeemable rupture between hierarchy and faithfulness that in the civil sphere has been consummated between those who rule and citizens. On the other hand, even the exponents of the synodal church are under threat of having secrets exposed, no more or less than the clients of the guy with the island and that hip hop star who's been in the news lately. It is no surprising that the outcome of the elections has outraged the exponents, meaning the supporters of the embedded government, who for decades, with the support, or in this case, the embedded church, he says, with the support of the embedded government, infiltrated the Catholic Church and worked for her demolition. The Jesuits, together with their Pope, accomplices of the big plan to undermine civilization, ought to soon suffer the same cancellation that in recent years they have inflicted, also making use of the political support they enjoy on those who have denounced their betrayal. Yes, we can, said 40, number 44, 47's first predecessor, and we've seen it. The embedded government has indeed been able to do everything it promised, from protecting the followers of Satan among the elites, especially those who like to feast on the most young, to covering up the most evil cases of corruption, for imposing the insane policies of green and thermometer problems to administer a of the 2020 affliction, and from the destruction of agriculture and animal husbandry, from the energy crisis provoked to destroy the economic work of the nation to the conflict going on in Eastern Europe and the Middle East. All this has been done by transferring billion pockets of citizens to the offshore accounts of multinational corporations, companies that make these solutions, and humanitarian organizations that are always headed by well-known families of the world's usurious high finance. And mostly quote. And where do the bishops fit in with all that? You'd think they'd be resisting it, but they're not. They're profiting the system directly. That is where they are at with all of this. And that is why they are defending the status quo. They have to defend the status quo. They have no choice. So how do they preserve their own actual integrity, their own legitimacy? I don't think they can. They have a meeting right now in Baltimore that's ongoing that is essentially existential in nature, not for the bishops themselves. I mean, they're apostolic men. They will have successors eventually, but I mean for the actual their their financial existence is under threat because of the amount of money they pull in on that issue. The whole house of cards may come tumbling down for them. And that is why they are very concerned about this stuff. But their meeting is typically closed doors. So we're only going to hear whatever final statements they have to make. So pay attention to their behavior in the coming months, especially after the 20th of January, when these policies start to go into force. Laura says, follow the yellow brick road. Money is the root of all evil. It's not the money is the root of all evil. It's the love of money. And when you see how the word love is used in the Bible, when it talks to these things, we're talking about idolatry of money, right? People who actually put money above their faith. And that's what we're talking about here. Yes, Bishop Strickland is praying the rosary outside the meeting this morning, and I will have his address that he gives for you tomorrow. So tune in for that. If there's any thoughts on this in the chat, let me know here. Let's take a look here. Well, Harold says, what about the countries of origin? Why don't bishops speak about the governments that create the problems? Well, here, part of the reason, I have a practical reason. I have heard them say that they believe that the folks in question are going to bolster the church here. That doesn't actually turn out to be true. Something like half of them leave the Catholic Church within like 5 years of arriving and either become rock worship Protestants or atheists, meaning they suffer the same fate as everybody else in this culture. But they honestly believe that it's going to fill up the Catholic churches here, and it hasn't happened. I mean, it's been a problem for 30 years in this country. So why are they thinking this is going to take care of the problem? Patty says TLM priests need to defy the bishop and continue to pray the Holy Mass. Well, we'll see. They get canceled immediately. All right, folks. Any final thoughts on all this in the comments, please? Please pray for these bishops that they have their consciences illuminated by the light of our Lord, and they actually do His will, and actually represent the faith in the way they should, because there is a real concern about dignity, about human dignity at this that is legitimate. It would be very easy to cross the line on this, but at the same time, that they have their consciences illuminated and they actually lead as Catholics should and do what is actually required of them in this time, instead of being so concerned about finances, because it's pretty easy to see that they are concerned primarily with money. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.